Welcome, everyone. My name is Sophie Roe. And I've just seen that I misspelled my own name. Great. I am the political employee of the BesD. We are a German sex worker organization. Some of you might know us from. Okay, someone else's job. Okay, not my job. I'm a bit nervous, to be honest. I've never done this in English before, and I'm also a bit sick, so please bear with me. Today we're going to listen to Luca Stevenson, who is going to present a community report about violence that sex workers experience and how they have access to justice. Our team right now is Luca Stevenson and Johanna Weber and Nick Laurent. Nick is the one who's recording our meeting and who's also going to be the one who's going to put meeting online afterwards. So if you, as some of us, don't speak English as fluently, we will translate everything after, because we're recording, and then you can watch it again with German subtitles to make it easier for everyone. We're also going to upload a summary of the community report that Luca is going to present, so that we linked the community report already, but it's 60 pages. Maybe not everyone has the time to read that, but we have a summary of that. I made a summary of that, so we can show that. To introduce myself, as I said, my name is Emma. I started sex work in 2019, and I started to work as a political employee for BesD in winter. And then we have Johanna Weber, our political spokesperson.
Yes. Hello and good evening. My name is Johanna Weber, and I'm sex worker and the political spokeswoman of the sex worker organization BesD from Germany. And my English is awful. And so this young woman, Emma, has to moderate everything. But I will do my very best. Well, you know, I'm good in sex work. I'm not good in languages. But I'm one of the grounder of BesD, and so I have to tell you some words about us. Well, we grounded 10 years ago, and BesD is short for Berufsverband Erotische und Sexuelle Dienstleistung, and because nobody is able to remember this, we don't call us BesD, we call us BesD. It's easier. Simply the best. And we are the only German-wide association for sex workers, and we have around 750 members. So we are the largest organization for sex workers in Europe, and all our members are sex workers or have been sex workers. And important to say is that we don't do politics or other things only for our members, and we stand up for the rights and for the interests of all sex workers in Germany. That means improving the working and living conditions of sex workers. And I myself, as a political spokeswoman, is my job in my free time, and in real life I'm a sex worker. I've started with sex work 30 years ago. It was in Hamburg in a small brothel. And nowadays I'm working as a touchable dominatrix in different towns in Germany. And now I'm really looking forward to hearing the words of Luca, and I will really try to understand everything. And I'm giving back to Emma.
Oh yeah, good that you're giving the mic back to me, because I forgot something actually. So all of you can watch and listen, but you cannot speak yourself, you're muted. But we encourage you to ask questions. So if you have a question in English or in German, please type it in the chat, because after the presentation, Luca is going to answer your questions. So please feel free to ask everything that you're interested in about the presentation. Das Ganze jetzt auch nochmal auf Deutsch für diejenigen, deren Englisch nicht so gut ist. Bitte fragt, was auch immer euch interessiert. Luca hat ein paar Folien vorbereitet zum Präsentieren und wird die Präsentation halten. Ihr könnt nichts sagen, ihr könnt zuhören und ihr könnt eure Kamera anmachen, aber ihr könnt euer Mikro nicht anmachen, ihr seid auf leise gestellt. Ihr könnt aber jegliche Fragen, die ihr zum Vortrag habt oder auch an ESWA habt, weil Luca ist von ESWA, könnt ihr in den Chat schreiben. Yeah, and with that I will give the mic to Luca.
Guten Abend. Nice to meet you all. So my name is Luca Stevenson. It's a great pleasure to be here and very excited by the big turnout. So congratulations, BesD, for this event. So briefly about myself, I'm a sex worker. I've been a sex worker for the last 20 years and a sex worker rights advocate for a little bit less than that. I've been involved in different organizations such as the French Union of Sex Workers, different UK organizations like Sex Worker Open University or ScotPep in Scotland. And for the last 10 years, I worked for the European Sex Worker Network. So you will see in the presentation, I sometimes use ICRSC, which was our original name, International Committee on the Rights of Sex Workers in Europe. But we changed our name 2 years ago now, and we are called ESWA, European Sex Worker Rights Alliance. Partly because nobody could remember ICRSC name, so we changed the name. And so you might see in the report, we are referring to ICRSC because this is when we wrote the report, but we are now called ESWA. I will share my screen. Hopefully, I do this properly. 1 second. So, let's see. Okay. Share screen. Okay, I hope you see properly. That's fine. I think so. So I'm going to present this report called Undeserving Victims, which is a report that we published 4 years ago now, a community report on migrant sex workers victims of crime in Europe. So first of all, a little bit about myself. I've been involved in sex worker rights activism for a long time now. I was one of the co-founders of sex worker advocacy and resistance movement in the UK. I work now at the European Sex Worker Rights Alliance as program director. And I also sit on the board of the Red Umbrella Fund, the Global Network of Sex Work Project, where there's no logo here. And I'm also a volunteer with Médecins du Monde France on their Jasmine project, a project to end violence against sex workers. And I'm also on the advisory committee of Freedom Collaborative, which is an initiative, a global initiative to end human trafficking. Just briefly about our organization, ESWA was founded in 2004 under the name ICRSC. We are a European network of more than 100 organizations in 30 countries now in Europe and Central Asia. So we have members in Iceland, Central Europe, European Union countries, Kyrgyzstan, etc. We now have a secretariat in Brussels where we also collaborate with other partners, non-profit organizations, as well as European institutions. We have a small team of 7 people now, although most people are not full-time. And this is our main priorities: access to health for sex workers, including sexual health, of course, addressing HIV, but also mental health; access to justice for sex workers victims of crime or violence, exploitation; labor rights and social inclusion, not exclusion, in particular looking at socio-economic issues faced by sex workers, including access to housing, for example; legal reform, promoting positive legal reforms such as decriminalization; and more recently, digital rights of sex workers, looking at all the issues related at digital rights such as censorship, privacy, data protection, financial discrimination online, etc. And we have this 3-pronged approach, which is movement building and capacity building. So we do a lot of trainings for our members This year, we have several trainings for transgender sex workers, for male sex workers, for racialized sex workers. We also partner with many organizations for different projects, including research. We have a focus on research as well. So this research I'm going to present. And this year, we actually have 3 more research, one on experience of policing by sex workers, one on access to PrEP, and one on stigma and discrimination in healthcare settings. And finally, one of our main focus is doing advocacy and lobby for sex workers' rights at the European level, but also a bit at the international level and in collaboration with our members at national level. So not any questions you might have, and I'll answer at the end. I'm not able to see anything else but the presentation. So if you raise your hand, I might not see it. So briefly about the report. We decided to do this report as we know that sex workers face high levels of violence in Europe and globally. And this violence is exacerbated, is increased because of stigma and marginalization. So we oppose this definition of prostitution as a form of violence. We recognize sex work as work. And we say that, yes, it's a dangerous work because of the stigma, the criminalization, and the marginalization. We know as well that the majority of sex workers in Western Europe are migrants, many from other European countries, including Central Europe, but also from the global South, Latin America, Asia, Africa in particular. And we also know that crimes against sex workers are frequently overlooked at the European or international level. And even worse, we know that violence and crimes against sex workers are actually instrumentalized to further push for criminalization, such as the Swedish model. So we see that violence against sex workers is used as a tool against sex workers to increase our precarity and our vulnerability. Finally, we also know that sex workers and their organization are usually excluded from policymaking around gender-based violence and other issues. So with S1 now, we are members of different European Union platforms, such as violence against civil society platform on victims' rights, for example. But this is quite recent. In many countries, sex workers are not included in policymaking. And this is something that we want to shift and change. This picture is from a protest in Paris following the murder of Vanessa Campos, who was a Peruvian transgender woman who was murdered in Paris a few years ago now, just following the criminalization of clients of sex workers in France. And this is the organization BesD, our members in Paris, representing mainly migrant and trans sex workers. So about the report, we succeeded in obtaining some funding to organize and do these reports. And you can see here the countries that were involved. So we opened a call for our members to apply, and we had members from UK, Ireland, France, Greece, Italy, Romania, etc., who were involved in the research. I think we also had like North Macedonia involved. And this is the number of respondents. We interviewed 5 sex workers in 10 countries. So it was a small research. 5 sex workers, migrant sex workers who had been victimized. So the criteria was the person had to be a sex worker, a migrant sex worker, migrant sex workers who had been victim of crime. So it was also quite difficult sometimes to obtain interviews because of lack of trust by migrant sex workers with institutions. And we had a majority of cis women interviewed, 55%, 38% were trans women, and 4% were cis male sex workers. When it comes to migration status, 42% were EU nationals, so from other EU countries, but migrant in often from like Romania, for example, migrant in Western Europe, such as France. Other were non-EU nationals, so not from the EU, but from third countries. And finally, a small percent were unknown or didn't want to disclose their migration status or country of origin, sorry. So we asked sex workers, migrant sex workers, what happened, what was the crime that they were a victim of. And as you can see, psychological and physical violence were the highest form of violence that they experimented. psychological violence, including threats and stalking. We also had high levels of insults, robbery, sexual assault, including rape, labor exploitation, including trafficking, and non-payment for services. And although robberies are not usually listed as acts of gender-based violence, the research also showed that sex workers were actually targeted because they were sex workers. So for us, we do consider that this type of robbery and violent robbery are also a form of gender-based violence against sex workers. And around 20% of cases were related to labor exploitation, forced labor, or trafficking in human beings. So the research showed us that more than a third did not report to the police due to fear of arrest or deportation. So one of the main questions we wanted to answer from this report was, what is the relation between sex workers, victims of crime, and the police? Are they able to access justice when they are victimized? And around half of the case of sex worker, in half of the cases, it was a sex worker group, such as BesD, for example, or sex worker-led organization, although BesD was not part of the research, but I'm taking an example, which facilitated access to the police and assisted sex worker victims when reporting. And evidence also showed that sex workers' fear of receiving punishment instead of support from authorities is well-funded. Sex workers are often not viewed by the police as ideal or deserving victims. So this is a quote from one sex worker in France who said, "I didn't know anyone. I didn't speak French well enough. I was afraid to call the police because I didn't have papers. It was really a difficult situation with a lot of aggression in the middle of winter. People told me not to call the police because they could arrest me. So when I was attacked, my only chance was to run away, or sometimes someone would defend me." And as you can see, the majority, not the majority, but like a large third didn't report to the police at all. Around a third went to the police, 28% went to the police directly, and 28% turned to a sex worker-led organization or an NGO that helped them report the crime. So we looked as well at what were the factors that supported the reporting to the police or were obstacles in reporting to the police. So what some of the supportive or enabling factors were the involvement of sex worker collective or a trusted NGO that encouraged and facilitated the reporting, trust and knowledge of and good experience with police officers, with specific police officers committed to protecting sex working communities, knowledge that revealing the sex work statute would not be used against them, and situation in which the fear of the criminals or offenders was actually greater than the fear of negative consequence of calling the police. As a sex worker in Ireland said, "I was afraid and ashamed of going to the police about the situation because I don't even know if it's okay legally to be an escort." And that's one of the issues as well, that in many countries, migrant sex workers are not aware of the legality or illegality of sex work and are really nervous of reporting crime to the police because they could be arrested for sex work. Some of the obstacles were the fear of the consequences of reporting as an undocumented migrant, the fear of detention and deportation, the fear of the consequences of reporting as a sex worker, like fines, prosecution, for sex work-related offenses such as soliciting, brothel keeping, losing the custody of a child, being outed as a sex worker, fear of being evicted from one's home or apartment. So this is a real fear, and that's been manifested in many countries, sex workers being evicted, fear of negative consequences of reporting for others, such as co-workers, apartment owners, or etc., and previous negative experience with and general distrust towards the police. So when we asked the sex workers what was their experience with the police, we can see that some mentioned having both good and bad experience, 24%. Some mentioned having only good experience, and 36 mentioned having only bad experience. Where I think our research is a little bit weak is that by bad experience, we actually mean from degrading treatment to physical violence. And what we call good experience is basically the police doing their work. So with a bit of a reflection now, I think we would do things differently, because I think we can't just say on one hand, oh, the police treating you with respect and doing their work is a good experience, but the police sexually assaulting you is a bad experience. I think we would reframe things a little bit. So some of the negative experience range from police ignoring a report to sexual assault against a sex worker victim of crime. Sex workers who evaluated experience with police as positive highlighted the sympathy and understanding of an individual police officer or the support of an NGO. And that's something that we notice as well, is often sex workers would say that they had one positive experience with one specific police officer rather than with the whole force. And finally, undocumented migrant sex workers' relationship to the police is often conflicting, as they are seen as criminals violating immigration and sex work laws instead of being perceived as victims. And you can see here in the graph that the main negative experience was degrading treatment, psychological violence, followed by insults, threats, sexual violence in almost 10% of the cases, physical violence, and confiscation of earnings and assets. And I do think that our research, is only like 15 interviews of migrant sex workers, but the actual levels of physical and sexual violence is much higher, but it's very difficult for sex workers to report. And again, you also have to think that these 50 sex workers we interviewed were sex workers who have a relationship with an organization. So they already have some kind of contact with a service provider or a community organization. And so for many sex workers who don't have this type of contact and might be a victim of violence from the police, this is actually not recorded in our research. And one of the sex workers, I think from the UK, said, as soon as the men left, so the criminals, as soon as the men left, I called the police. When they arrived, officer asked questions about how many clients we had. A few days later, I received a letter threatening me with prosecution for brothel keeping. Police have refused to take photographic and other evidence. 5 weeks after the attack, I received a deportation letter on the grounds that I was not a genuine visitor to the UK. My deportation order was only stopped because of the support of the English Collective of Prostitutes, which was the organization who did the interview. So some of the key findings relating to policing is that stereotyping, stigma, and gender bias have a far-reaching consequences on sex workers' access to justice and discourage sex workers from reaching out to the police and looking for help. That the police have rigid standards when what they consider as appropriate behavior for women, and is a form of like sexism against sex workers and transphobia, etc. Prior negative experience with the police and lack of trust is often determinant in decisions whether or not to report crime. And the sex workers purposely avoid contact with the police as they are afraid to being punished for sex work or municipal bylaws infringement. We also found that sex workers fear to be perceived as offenders and not as victims, and that the criminalization of sex work exacerbates sex workers' vulnerability to violence, as it pushes them out of sight of the public and prevents them from screening clients, leading to hurried negotiation, and does not allow them to work together for their safety. A firewall, which is a legal process between immigration and enforcement and access to justice. So in many countries, there is no firewall between policy and immigration enforcement. So when migrant sex workers want to report a crime, they are at risk of deportation, and this compromises the non-discrimination principles for undocumented migrant victims of crime. We also found that policing needs to be more responsive to sex workers' needs and more accountable to ensure safe reporting. And of course, that police violence and discrimination against sex workers must be addressed urgently. So, as we were mentioning at the beginning, we know already that migrant sex workers face high levels of hate crime and gender-based violence. And from our membership in 100 countries, we know that sex workers, many migrant sex workers are unable to report crimes due to stigma, fear of arrest, deportation, in the context of criminalization of sex work and migration. That the violence against sex workers remain underexplored issue and often instrumentalized against sex workers' rights to push for criminalization agenda, and that the current ideological trend to abolish prostitution by criminalizing clients of sex workers negatively impact sex workers' trust in authorities and exclude sex workers and the organization from policy making. These were some of the recommendations that we have for policymakers. Of course, addressing violence against sex workers is a priority, but this must be done by including sex workers and the organization. For example, that's the EU level Violence Against Women Directive, the Victims' Rights Strategy, and monitoring the implementation of the provision of the Victims' Rights Directive in relation to marginalized communities. So at a national level, this means that including sex workers in violence against women or gender-based violence strategies and victims' rights strategies and recognizing and promoting the implementation of a firewall between public immigration enforcement and service provision in the area of social services and access to justice system, so that migrant sex workers can go to the police to report a crime without fearing being arrested and deported for immigration offenses. Promote police accountability and scrutiny to end police violence and discrimination. I would say this was a very polite way of asking, real accountability from the police, which is, a big debate. And as a European organization, we try to find a language that would fit also with our wide membership. But there's many conversation within the sex worker rights movement, racial justice movement, not only about like increasing police accountability, but also defunding the police or abolishing the police together in order to promote other ways for community safety, and promoting a rights-based approach to sex work, in particular the decriminalization of sex work and all forms of legal oppression against sex workers. And that's it for the presentation. You can find the report on the website. It's translated in several languages. And I'm going to stop the screen now. So I wanted to mention this report. It was published 4 or 5 years ago now. As a follow-up to this report, we are now doing a much more in-depth research on sex workers' experience of the police. We are doing 20 interviews of sex workers who had direct experience of the police in 12 countries, including Belgium, who recently decriminalized sex work, Israel, who criminalized clients, and 10 other countries. And this is something that we want to continue focusing on. Some of the EU policy development that I mentioned, which are actually quite interesting, is that at the time of writing the report, the European Commission was working on the gender-based violence strategy. This has now been named Violence Against Women Directive, which has been written by the European Commission. And we were actually glad to see that it includes sex workers as a group at high risk of violence and deserving specialized service. So it does show that despite the exclusion of sex workers, policymakers can listen to the needs of sex workers. And currently, the Violence Against Women Directive is being discussed in the trialogue, so between the Parliament and the Council and the European Union. And we hope that they continue to keep sex workers. Sadly, there is a push to change the framing and define prostitution as a form of violence against sex workers. So define the prostitution as a form of violence against women, but we hope that the European Commission keep the text as it is. Meanwhile, there are other developments such as a prostitution report pushed in particular by German MEP Maria Neucher, that is being pushed at the European Parliament. What we see is that little by little, the voices of sex workers are being listened to. We're still very far away from a very inclusive policy making, but it's also in part due to the support of other organizations. So we know that a few years ago, Amnesty International took a clear stand in favor of decriminalization. A few days ago, you might have seen the International Commission of Jurists also announcing their position for decriminalization. And there's a growing number of both civil society, researchers, and other voices, including the World Health Organization, in support of decriminalization. At the European level, we launched the European Coalition on Sex Workers' Rights and Inclusion, which includes 15 organizations, including the European Network Against Racism, the Platform for International Cooperation on Undocumented Migrants, the European LGBT Network, the European HIV Network. So 15 really strong organizations that work in human rights and other fields of marginalized population. And this really showed that the dialogue is shifting and the voices of pro-criminalization are being more isolated. However, they're still very strong and we need to keep pushing against this ideological attempt to abolish prostitution. And I think that's it for me, and I'm happy to answer any question.
Great, thank you. There was a question in the chat that is easily to answer. The question to the report, we shared the link. if you cannot open the link in the chat, you can also, you all applied for the Zoom call link to my email. So I think you found that through our website, and the report is also linked there. So, as I said in the beginning, but I don't know if everyone was already in the Zoom call when I said that, I summarized the report, and we will put that on our website. So if you don't have the time to read the whole report, you can read my summary of it later. But I will not do that. I wanted to do that today, but as I said, I'm sick, so I will do that in the next days when I'm feeling better. So, questions for you. The first question was one of organization, if it's possible to share the slides of your presentation afterwards.
Yes, of course, yes.
Okay. Then the next question was, how many people were interviewed for the report?
Yeah, so it was a small research. So we had 5 interviews in 10 countries. So 50 sex workers were interviewed, and I think only 48 interviews were used because 2 of them were not relevant. I forgot why, but maybe the person wasn't a sex worker at the end, or they were not migrants, something like this.
Okay.
48.
Okay. 48. Okay, so nearly 50. So the next question was, do you think that violence against sex workers is connected to the customers being anonymous? My English, sorry. So do you think that if the customers would be identified, that less violence against sex workers would happen?
Well, that's an interesting question. I haven't thought about this before, but I think we have to be careful when we talk about violence against sex workers, because there is many factors that influence the vulnerability of people to violence generally. So we know that sex workers have high levels of violence because majority are women, majority are members of the LGBT community, majority are migrants, undocumented migrants, or racialized. And actually, like, there's a intersection of like different form of vulnerability, including class, where, street-based sex workers, for example, might face more violence than like indoor sex worker, although there is different study and different research about this. For us, we try to understand violence as this like complex phenomenon, and we refuse to say that, the reason why like prostitution is violence, or the reason why there is violence is because of this one specific issue. And so there might be less violence if clients had to sign somewhere. However, this is also a human rights violation of like rights to privacy. The same way that we are against registration of sex workers because of the right of privacy, we also don't believe that it would be like beneficial for clients to register, because we are generally as ESWA in support of data minimization. So we don't believe that for the state to gather more data, sex workers or client is necessarily beneficial for sex workers. We actually what would happen is that some people would register, but many wouldn't, and then would still get away with it. So for us, the reason, like one of the main reasons we see that sex workers are at risk of violence is because we know that criminals or people who have bad intention know that sex workers are not going to report to the police. And this is why, for example, in country, sorry, I speak too fast. I saw the message at the same time. So we see that in countries, for example, with the Swedish model, after the implementation of the Swedish model, violence against sex workers has increased. There's no discussion about that. It's been reported in Norway, in France, in Ireland in particular. And it's mainly trans women, and it's mainly migrant women, and it's mainly racialized women who face this form of violence, because the people, perpetrators of violence, know that these communities are not going to report to the police, and therefore they can get away with it. And for us, this is why we really believe that decriminalization is not going to solve all the issues. It's not going to decriminalize and violence is going to end. By decriminalizing, you will give at least some of the same rights that sex workers versus general citizens. And it's a little bit of comparison with LGBT communities. It's actually quite recent that even homosexuality is decriminalized. European countries like to be very proud of how progressive we are. It's only been a few decades that homosexuality is decriminalized. and there's still high levels of violence against LGBT communities. So for us, we believe that the law needs to change, and then the attitudes of people need to change. The stigma needs to end. And there's no magic solution to end stigma against sex worker when stigma and discrimination against sex worker is so embedded in our culture, like patriarchal culture, sexism, etc. So we believe there's a huge work that needs to be done, and there's no easy solution to just ending violence. What we believe is that decriminalizing, destigmatizing, including sex workers are all very essential approaches to decrease violence against sex workers.
I also what I took from that is that right now in Germany, the case is that sex workers have to be registered in order to work legally. Clients don't have to be registered. But what I'm thinking is, of course, not all sex workers are registered. And those who aren't are maybe more afraid to report a crime if something happens to them, because they know that they are not working legally. And I could imagine that if all of my clients had to register, I would lose clients because some of them wouldn't want to register before booking me, before seeing me. So if I needed that money, I would probably also see clients who aren't registered, and then I would be afraid if something happens to report something, because I would have broken a law if there was something like law to make sure that clients have to be registered as well. So I think it's an idea that may sound like an easy solution, but in reality only creates more classes in between the sex worker community and makes it harder. So the next question is, someone writes, you made a comment about people without papers reporting crimes without danger for deportation or similar punishment. Can you explain something about these laws? How does it work?
Yes, so I think I can answer this question and the question about why migrant sex workers in the paper. So what we did is that we consulted with our membership on saying we want to do this research. What will be the topic you want us to work on? And the responses was in majority the issues faced by migrant sex workers. So we know, personally, after like 2 decades of activism, I don't really believe in like any statistics that you might see around sex work. Like you will see some numbers floating around. I don't know what's the latest number about Germany, but 100,000 sex workers in the UK, 40,000 in France, 90% of migrant, 80% of victim of trafficking. You see all kind of numbers. What we know is that the majority of sex workers are migrants in Western Europe, and that they face the highest level of violence. So for us, what we wanted to do is look at the specific needs of migrants. We didn't decide undocumented migrants, just generally migrant sex workers, keeping it large like this, because they know they are the most at risk. And we didn't want to include all sex workers. So the current research we are doing is sex workers, migrants or not, victims of who had experience with the police, either as a victim, a witness, or a perpetrator, like the police accusing them of something or being accused of something. But for this specific research, it was much smaller. I wanted to explore more migrant sex workers, victims of crime. And in particular, we wanted to look at the issues that undocumented migrants face. And in many countries, that's what came out of the research, is that whether there is a difference between the reality of what will happen and people's perception. So, for example, in many countries, sex workers will not go to the hospital because they do not trust the hospital not to be linked to the state and then being deported or arrested if they go to the hospital for like STI, for example. So we have in the UK, for example, we have many migrant sex workers, maybe from Romania or Central European countries, that do not go to the special services available to them because they are afraid that going there would put them at risk of arrest and deportation. In reality, I think things have changed since the research with Brexit and more. So many of them actually wait to go back to Romania, to get tested there, to get their medication, etc. But that has actually a big impact on sex workers' health as well, because you lack the trust of the health services. And this is the same with access to justice. For us, what we're really trying to show with this report is that any sex workers, whether they have the right papers to work, to live in this country, if they are victims of crime, they should be able to go to the police and report the crime they should go, or they should be able to give the information to another organization so that this crime can be registered and so that the person who committed the crime can then be arrested and then can stop committing this crime. Because what we also see is that there is an escalation of violence. And I will give you one specific example from France, where we have, in Paris, there is a large Chinese sex worker community. So there's around 500-600, again, statistics, women, many of them middle-aged, coming from China and working in France in the sex industry. And they work in the street, etc., or they share an apartment. And since the criminalization of clients, the number of clients has decreased. This is true. There's less clients. However, same with this question about registration of clients. The clients who remain are clients who are a bit less afraid of the law than the general clients. They say, well, you know what? I might be arrested, but doesn't matter. I want to go see a sex worker. And there was a particular example of a sex worker. So I don't like too much this like trigger warning, but just in case it's important to say, that's like a murder case where Chinese sex workers knew that this particular client was aggressive. He started to be aggressive. He started to threaten sex workers. And they would say like, oh, don't see this one. He's quite dangerous. There's something not right with him. But one sex worker, because of the criminalization of clients, they would be arrested by the police, the sex workers. Even when they were not working, they would go to the pharmacy to buy medication and the police would stop them, ask for their ID, for their documentation. So sex workers were almost afraid to leave their house, even to go shopping. And so there was less clients, they were less allowed to walk in the street. And this guy continued to see them because they didn't have many options. His behavior increased from threats to violence to sexual violence. And despite that, the sex worker decided to go with him because that was one of the only options she had to make money. And he murdered her, and since then he's been arrested, etc. So for us, this is quite a specific case, but it's actually show that even when sex workers know that a client is potentially violent, if that's the only way you have to make an income, you will take this risk because there is the risk of violence and there's the reality of not having any money for food, for rent, etc. So for us, this was quite a specific case where if the Chinese sex worker community had been able to go to the police and say, we know this guy is violent, we know this guy raped our colleague, you need to do something about this, then he would have been arrested and our colleague would have been murdered. But instead, the police would arrest sex workers, Chinese sex workers, for like immigration offenses. So for us, this is a very specific case of why migrant sex workers are more at risk, because they do not trust the police of having the best interest of sex workers in their mind.
Thank you. That was very interesting and so thorough, your explanation. The next question would be, what would we need to protect sex workers better?
What do we need? I think for us, I mean, I don't know who's in the room and how you are involved in activism. I always found interesting how social movements decide what is the priority. And as a social movement, you have to come together and identify what do we want in priority. So our movement is calling for decriminalization because decriminalization would have a positive impact on sex workers. It would mean that potentially with positive immigration reforms, sex workers like the Chinese sex worker would be able to report violence against them because they would not be afraid of being arrested, etc. I think that would provide some support. We also believe in like community-led initiatives. So we see in the report that having a trusted organization, like a sex worker organization, Médecins du Monde in France, others, allow sex workers to trust somebody, speak to them, and then report to the police. However, these are all kind of, like there are much more things that can be done to prevent violence against sex workers. And one of the main things that can be done is also looking at other socioeconomic responses to prostitution and sex work. So we are sex workers. We fight for the right to sell sex. We fight for the right to be sex workers without discrimination. However, we must also acknowledge and recognize that many sex workers do it because of lack of other economic opportunities. And often those are the people who are the most at risk of violence. So if you say, for example, sex workers who use drugs, like in many countries, there is a high levels, like there's a big overlap between injecting drug user, women injecting drug user, and sex workers. So there's an overlap there. Because as an injecting drug user, you have very limited options to make a living. You face other form of discrimination, you face other form of punishment. And actually, this really limits your opportunity to do anything else than sex work. And in that sense, you're also more vulnerable because as the Chinese sex workers I was taking example, your opportunities are very limited. So for us as ESWA, we really try to center the needs and the voices of most marginalized in the sex industry. Let's say, for example, we've been working in Albania or Turkey, Romania, where the trans community, like a large number of trans women work in the sex industry because of transphobia and lack of access to education and other form of employment. So for us, it's also very important to fight for these structural factors that really limit people's opportunity to make a living outside of sex work. And often when we say that, we don't want to be misunderstood. It's like anybody who wants to do sex work should do sex work without having to justify themselves, without any form of discrimination. But however, we also really need to fight for better socioeconomic opportunities so people don't have only sex work as an economic options. And it's the same for undocumented migrants. In the research, we have refugees, young men from Syria selling sex in Greece for almost nothing. And they also at high risk of violence because people know that these people are vulnerable and they will use them as targets. So for us, we cannot simply look at legal reform and thinking that decriminalization is going to end violence. We need decriminalization and we need a quite radical socio-economic, challenges to our society so that the most vulnerable people are not left out and only rely on sex work to survive.
If I remember correctly, I've read the report, but I think it was in December. There was also a part where it explained that the rates of violence are higher on the streets than in brothels. So that what I took from that, because here in Germany, it is legal, sex work is legal, so brothels are legal, but we have a lot of, our laws are currently evaluated, and we are afraid that that it will not stay legal the way it is. And many people, from my experience, are criticizing brothels, and I'm always trying to explain how important it is to have a space to work in, because having a space that sex workers can work in means that they are safer to work in that space than to work somewhere else if they don't have that space. So that's what I took from that study. Do I remember that correctly?
Yes, I think one of the key demands in decriminalization is also decriminalization of third parties. So there's been such a big focus on clients, with the Swedish model, clients need to be criminalized, etc. But actually, one of the main issues is that third parties in most countries are criminalized. So brothel owner, agency owner, platforms where sex workers work with FOSTA, SESTA, in the law in the US that shut down websites. And actually all these ways of criminalizing third parties, which are meant to protect sex workers, actually just make sex workers more vulnerable to violence. So we know in Ireland, I think like 90% of arrests of sex workers are under this brothel keeping law. So two sex workers working together can be arrested for brothel keeping. They work together, they share the rent, they share the bills, and that means they are, profiting from one another, and they can be arrested for brothel keeping. There was a specific case in Ireland where several Romanian women were working together in a flat without a manager. They were like traveling together, working together, and one of them was pregnant. They were arrested by the police, and I think one of them went to jail for this. And for us, this is completely absurd, is that it's sending the message that if you want to work legally, you have to work by yourself. And we have many cases like this where sex workers say the only way I can work legally is if I work by myself. And actually, that's also increasing the vulnerability to violence, because people will know, and sometimes you have clients calling and being like, oh, are you alone in the flat? Are you working by yourself? And that's clearly in order to have information. And for us, this is very, very dangerous.
Thank you. The next question is about the one second, about the Istanbul Convention. And the question is if it includes any previous concerns about sex workers. One second, sorry. I'm just going to read that. Do you know if the Istanbul Convention of the Council of Europe, so Action Against Violence Against Women and Domestic Violence, includes any previous any provisions concerning sex workers? If not, the Council of Europe should be informed about your report so that the Istanbul Convention could be eventually updated.
So I don't think the Istanbul Convention does mention sex work, but there is I think there is a debate, like ideological debate between, on one hand, people who want to say prostitution is violence, look at the Istanbul Convention. But actually, if you look at the Istanbul Convention, I don't think it says anything about sex work, but it has a big focus on consent and recognizing that without consent, it's a form of violence. And this is really like where the sex worker rights movement is really strong, because we say that we know what is work and we know what is sexual violence, and we are able to consent. And I think that's something that pro-criminalization lobby and organization are trying to shift the dialogue and saying that sex workers are not able to consent. Therefore, all type of sex work is violence against sex workers. And you could look, example, at in Spain last year. I don't know if you followed, but Spain passed a new law against sexual violence. And the law is called yes means yes, or no means no, I forgot. So, really like clearly defining what is sexual violence, really defining what is consent. When consent is breached, it's sexual violence. And they had to include a little paragraph that says that, we should also criminalize third parties, so brothel owner, because sex workers are not able to consent to working in the sex industry. So for us, it was so ironic that you develop a law about consent that recognizes that people are able to consent, and when they don't consent, it's violence. But however, you have to include a little paragraph that actually say, apart from sex workers, they just, they don't know what's good for them. They're never able to consent. And for me, the whole debate about the Nordic model is so insulting to sex workers and to victims of sexual violence, because many of us in the sex industry are also survivors of sexual violence. And we know the difference between rape and work. And telling us that we don't know the difference is actually the opposite of what the whole feminist movement is about. It's like we know our own experiences of violence. If you are not able to listen to me when I say that I was victim of violence, which is a huge thing, if you're not able to listen to me when I say I was victim, you should also be able to listen to me when I say I was not a victim. And it's the reverse of what the feminist movement should be about. And that's why there's really a pushback to say that it's actually dangerous both for sex workers and for victims of violence. And that's what we see as well with this report, is that sex workers victims of rape would go to the police, and the police would say, that was not rape, you're sex workers, you cannot be raped. And that's what the police say to sex workers. And that's actually a direct line to say if all prostitution is rape, then how do victims of rape in the sex industry are able to report this type of crime?
Okay, great, thank you. We have one last question. Someone reacted in the moment that you said that, so I hope you remember, because it's been a while. Someone asked that you mentioned an organization that just announced that it supports the decriminalization some days ago, but the person couldn't hear which organization that was.
Yes, it's called the International Commission of Jurists, ICJ. And on the 8th of March, they released the 8th of March principle. And it's quite important because it's quite influential organization that develop guidelines for the legal profession. And it's not just about sex work, it's about sexual health, drug use. I forgot exactly how it's framed. It's quite a long title. But there is one page about sex work that is very clear, that criminalization of sex work is just not effective, and it goes against human rights principle, etc. So we're very excited that they published this.
Okay, great, thank you. Then I would say we wrap it up here, because we have just 4 minutes left. thank you so much for your presentation. That was a lot to learn. I read the report already and I learned a lot. So I think I'm impressed. I'm really impressed. I would like to say goodbye to everyone. And if you want to join our next 1 hour, one topic meeting in German, then again, please write me an email. It will be in April and it will be about Sexualassistenz. So yeah, and if you couldn't get everything because it was in English and because it was so much to take in, we will translate this. As I said in the beginning, Nick is Nick is taking a video of this Zoom call, and we will put German subtitles under it. So you can watch the whole thing again with German subtitles, and you can read the summary of the community report on our website in some days when I'm feeling better. Okay.
Thank you so much for having me, and keep up the good work, everyone. Thank you, Emma. Thank you, Joanne.
Bye.
Bye.